from Luke chapter 14. And I want to begin reading in verse 12 for what will be the beginning of our message, but not the beginning of the story Jesus is going to tell. This is the setup. This is the lobby to the room, okay, that we're getting into. Jesus is at a dinner party. And in Luke chapter 14, verse 12, he says to the one who had invited him, "When you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or your rich neighbors in case they may invite you in return and you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. And you will be blessed because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." Now, with no other context and not really introducing much else other than just the intro I gave you, let's just imagine for a moment that we're sitting at this dinner with Jesus, and I want you to imagine, if you would, how many people in the room do you think are poor, crippled, lame, or blind? I think the fact that Jesus said this indicates that the total number of poor, crippled, lame, and blind are precisely 0. Otherwise, bringing this up at this dinner party is just superfluous. But because he brings it up, it gives me a really good idea that he's sitting in a really comfortable room in Chapin on a Friday night. You know, he's in an environment where he's relaxed, where there's not the stresses of the outside, where he's sort of in that place. And Jesus turns to his host and says, "What about a world outside of our room? What about a world that has the poor in it, and the lame in it, and the crippled in it, and the blind in it?" And he looks around and he goes, and I know now we're putting a little bit into his mouth, but if you'll go with me for a moment, I don't think it's a far stretch, because most of you nodded your head in agreement that the number was probably precisely 0. It's why he brought it up. So if it were 0, maybe his conversation sounds something like this: "Are there no poor in our town that we could have found one to feed? Do we not know a crippled person? Or maybe we just haven't encountered a blind man or a lame man, and everyone knows better because they've walked past them on their way to get to the dinner, and they moved past them in the marketplace and during the day." And Jesus then, by saying it, is pointing out the absence of the people for whom banquets would mean the most. The absence of the people for whom the food on the table would mean the most. And I don't think this was a real popular moment for Jesus. I can't imagine that the host of the party went, "Yes, you are right. That is exactly what we should do at our dinner party." I imagine that the host was rather embarrassed. I imagine that the people that threw the party were a little frustrated. Why? And maybe this is one of those moments. You know, Judas does end up selling Jesus down the river for 30 pieces of silver. And I don't think Judas thought he was going to the cross. I think he was getting Jesus to finally sit down with the right guys. This is one of those moments that I kind of think Judas in the back of the room went, "Oh gosh, why does he do this? We got invited into this party. Everything's good. The food's great. It's nice and comfy. He's got to come in here and throw this grenade in the middle of the living room right at the end of the dinner party and act like we're all so unappreciative of all this good that's going on. Why does he keep acting like this? Why can't Jesus just leave well enough alone?" I can't tell you how many times I read the Gospels and ask that same question. It's like Jesus is in an environment, you go, why can't he just leave well enough alone? It's way more socially acceptable here to just zip your lip. You know, Mom said if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all. And yet here's Jesus running right into the middle of the room going, "Hey, I got a story for you." And you get done and go, "Nobody wanted that story, Jesus. That's not the story you tell." But what fascinates me is the response. Because we didn't read the response. We just read what Jesus said. But let me read for you the response. It's the next verse from verse 15. "And one of the dinner guests, upon hearing this, said to him, 'Blessed is anyone who will eat bread in the kingdom of God.'" Now, just let that marinate for a second. Blessed is anyone who will eat bread in the kingdom of God. And is he right? It's a good call. Absolutely. Blessed is anyone that'll eat bread in the kingdom of God. But what does throwing anyone into the conversation do to the poor and the lame and the blind. Jesus has emphasized that the dinner banquet belongs to the people who don't have anything else, that are broken and hurting, who've been marginalized and left out. And those in the party hear Jesus do that. And rather than acknowledging that those lives matter, they throw an all lives matter into the mix. Did you catch it? So rather than letting them be poor and lame and blind, and yes, we need to do something about it, they elevated themselves into the exact same position as the poor, the lame, because they got just a touch offended that Jesus looked past the participants of the dinner out to people who weren't there. And what bothered them is that he would look past all of us. And so their response is, hey, actually, Jesus, all of us are blessed. Poor, blind, lame, not poor, not blind, not lame, doesn't matter who we are. All of us are blessed to eat in the kingdom of God. So, lazy answer. They didn't wrestle with the poor or the blind or the lame. They just threw themselves into the kingdom with them, which on the surface you go, yeah, we're all in that kingdom. But they also emphasized only the latter half of Jesus' comment. I'll just reread for you the latter half. You will be blessed because they can't repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. And so Jesus gives one sliver at the end of his speech on what happens at the end of the age. He goes, at the very end of all this, there's a resurrection of the righteous. Good things are going to happen. And the only thing that the response of the crowd is on that last part, because Jesus hasn't said anything to them about the kingdom, but they took the resurrection to be equal to the kingdom. And so when they hear a story about the resurrection, they go, yes, in the kingdom we all get to eat. So not only do they include themselves with the poor and the blind and the lame, but they run all the way to the end of the age, because if you can run to the end of the age, you don't have to deal with this age. One of our church obsessions with eschatology is because if we can master what happens at the end of the world, we aren't really that responsible for what's going on in our world. And so some of our obsessions with what happens at the end is so that we don't pay attention to what happens today. Because what happens today is hard to swallow. But if I can get my mind around what happens at the end, I can convince myself that we're heading towards the end, and then the end is all that really matters. But we know better in our hearts, because Jesus says if you host a dinner, invite the currently poor and the lame and the blind and those on the outside. Do that now. That's who they currently are. At the end of the age, we all get our reward. And when we respond, all we look at is at the story of the end of the age. And that's why I tell you it's a lazy response, because they try to throw themselves in with the poor and the blind, and they run to the end of the story. And I am so afraid of how many times I've ran to the end of the story to try and figure out how everything ends so that I didn't have to deal with the blind. I run to the end of the story to try to figure out how this ends so I don't have to deal with the poor. Because if I could just master this whole end of time thing, then I don't know if I'd have to deal with the lame or the outsider or the marginalized or the minority. They're out there. But won't it be wonderful there? Having no burdens to bear. We can just look past all of the people and just look towards heaven when we all get to heaven. What a day of rejoicing that will be. And if I'm just focused on what I'm going to rejoice in over there, then the blind and the lame and the poor aren't as big a deal, because when we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. And that's just good old-fashioned gospel, right? And Jesus will not let it rest.